not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
What's up guys, welcome back to Titus Actual Gaming. Today we're kicking off my weapon grade tier list series. Just a reminder, if you find my content useful, you can head over to my website, titustv.net. That is the easiest way to navigate my content. I even have searchable tables for you to find the video that you're looking for immediately. Please be sure to like this video if it helps you out so that other people can see it. Otherwise, please leave a comment below and let me know what you would like to see different. Okay, so diving right in here on Colossal Weapons. For those of you curious, I'm not going to be covering these in terms of strength, I'm covering them alphabetically. Looking at our first weapon, you can kind of see the criteria that I use for grading and what I determine to be important. The most heavily weighted factor here is going to be the damage, and that's going to be the damage upon reaching the soft cap of 80 in the stat that we're scaling for that weapon. Also being taken into account very heavily is whether or not you can use an Ash of War, because there's a lot of importance in utility Ash of Wars, but also because the Ash of War Royal Knight's Resolve gives you 80% more damage, which almost doubles the damage that we're seeing on this sheet here. The other factor that I weighed fairly heavily was whether or not there was elemental damage making up part of that damage in some of these unique weapons, because elemental damage, for example, if it was, part lightning damage, would have to go through 2 damage resistance checks, and a lot of enemies in the game have decent resist, so that was something that was sort of a negative. So starting off with the Axe of Godfrey, you'll see some more damage numbers here to see what I'm talking about in comparison, but 737 damage at the soft cap of 80 is relatively low damage for this weapon class, and it does not have the ability to use an Ash of War like Royal Knight's Resolve, so overall I gave it a C. Now the Dragon Great Claw, like the Axe of Godfrey, can also not use an Ash of War, so that's a negative strike against it. It has slightly more damage, but some of that damage is lightning, and again, because it has to pass 2 resistance checks, I gave it a C. One thing I do want to point out here is you see it for the first time we have a number in the soft cap 20 column, and there's a note there saying two-handed. That means that this weapon can be used with 20 strength, but you just have to two-hand it. And the yellow asterisk just denotes that this is part lightning damage. Overall though, the damage on this weapon is fairly low compared to other colossal weapons, so a C is a very fair grade. The Duelist Grade X is the first S tier weapon we're going to cover. I actually just posted a guide a couple days ago on why the Duelist Grade X is the best level 1 weapon in the game. So if you haven't seen that, I would definitely check it out. The TLDR on that video is basically that the Duelist Grade X has the highest base damage in the game. So before you have a lot of stats for scaling, it's a very, very strong weapon early on. So this weapon actually can use an Ash of War, and we want to go with the heavy affinity because that's going to provide us the most damage. As you can see in the affinity tab, the strength scaling goes to B 120. This is also the first weapon we see go up over 800 damage, and that's raw physical damage. You can easily do over 20,000 damage with this weapon in this game. It's one of the best weapons in the game. S tier, definitely use it. The Envoy's Greathorn is actually a pretty decent unique weapon. It can't use any Ashes of War, but the damage is pretty good. Some of that is holy damage, and that's what took it down to a B ultimately for me. But it has a pretty cool weapon skill, and if you were to scale all 3 stats, you would actually see really high damage numbers. For the purpose of this, to keep it fair, I only took strength, which was the highest scaling stat, up to 80, and left the rest at only what was required to use the weapon. The weapon skill on this is also pretty good, so altogether that earned it a B. The Falling Star Beastjaw is another really good unique weapon. It's our first unique weapon to actually breach into the A category, and that's because even though it has no Ash of War, it does really good damage. It actually pushed up over 800 damage. And that again was only with 80 strength. If you were to put Dex and Intelligence points in as well, you could actually scale this damage up to pretty insane numbers. The caveat to that is that you cannot use an Ash of War, and it is split damage again. So enemies with a high magic resistance are going to resist some of your damage. Overall, it's the best unique weapon we've talked about by far. It's a solid weapon, very strong, a pretty high A tier weapon for me. And for those of you that love the weapon skill of this weapon, I just want to remind you that this is about the damage potential of these weapons, not the utility of their skills. So Giza's Will was a tricky one to grade because it procs bleed damage. And right now, bleed is insane in the state of the game. So if this weapon didn't have inherent bleed ability, or if they nerf bleed in the future, this is a C weapon for me. You can't use an Ash of War, the scaling's not great, even at plus 10, it's 72 strength, 72 dex scaling, both Cs, and the overall damage is pretty low at 698. But I just can't overlook the power of proccing bleeds right now. It adds so much overall DPS to a build. It also helped its case that you could use this weapon at 20 strength by two-handing, so it's one of the few colossal weapons that can do that. So overall it got bumped up to a B, but they could really easily go back to a C in the next patch depending on what they do with bleed damage. Okay, the Giant Crusher. The Giant Crusher is the strongest colossal weapon in the game. It's the highest raw physical AR damage in the game, and therefore it takes its place at the very top of the S tier for me. On top of all of that, you can use any Ash of War that you want on here. It scales a 184S in strength when you put the heavy affinity on it, and this is another one of those weapons you can very easily do 20, 30, 40,000 damage with if you buff right. The only thing about this weapon is you need a lot of strength to use it. Even at the 55 soft cap, you still don't have enough strength to one-hand this, you still have to two-hand it to use it. But if you're going for a full strength build, this is the highest damage weapon you can use. I never really used the Golem's Halberd, so it kind of surprised me when I did the numbers that it came in the S tier. It even outdamaged my coveted Duelist Grade X once we hit the soft cap at 80. You can use any Ash of War on there, whether it's utility, Royal Knight's Resolve to max your damage. Definitely go the heavy affinity on there. And that pushes your strength scaling up to an A scaling with a whopping 158, which is the reason it ended up outdamaging the Duelist Grade X. The Duelist Grade X only had a B120 scaling, but they're still pretty close in damage because of that insane base damage that I was talking about with the Duelist Grade X. If you prefer the moveset of this weapon, you can comfortably use this knowing that this is one of the best strength weapons in the game. And for those reasons, it is an S tier weapon. The Great Club is an interesting weapon. You cannot put an Ash of War on there, you have to use the skill that comes with it. But you can put an affinity on this weapon. So if you put the heavy affinity on this weapon, your strength scaling goes to A, 153, which is phenomenal, and it ends up with 780 raw physical damage. I would put it on the highest end of the B tier, just because we can't use Royal Knight's Resolve or any utility Ashes of War, but I should mention that it is very, very close to an A tier weapon for me. I just can't think of a role that it could fill in that tier that would justify moving it up because of the Ash of War thing. So again, very, very strong damage. All physical damage. It's the highest you could go in the B tier. I could even argue that it would be a low A tier weapon. Aside from the Duelist Grade X, the Prelates Inferno Crozier is probably the best early game strength weapon in the game. It's basically the little brother of the Giant Crusher. Very, very close in damage to the Giant Crusher. Very similar moveset, and you can actually power stance these two weapons. Meaning you can put the Giant Crusher in your main hand, offhand this weapon, and run around using your left bumper jump attack to like dual hammer smash things, which is absolutely insane. You can also put any Ash of War on this, just like the Giant Crusher. I would throw the heavy affinity on here, and your strength scaling goes to an insane A scaling of 174. The skill that comes on this weapon is pretty cool, but I would personally run something like Royal Knight's Resolve or a way to further push my damage up. When you take all those things into consideration, it's very obvious why this is an S tier weapon. This is the second best Colossal weapon in the game, second only to the Giant Crusher, and it's a very close second. So S tier all day, not to mention it looks awesome as well. The Rotten Grade X was another one that surprised me. I always thought of it as kind of a worse version of the Duelist Grade X, which it still kind of is. Just like the Duelist Grade X, it can use Ashes of War. It benefits the most from the heavy affinity. The strength scaling goes to B120, which is identical to the scaling of the Duelist Grade X. The difference is it has a much lower base damage than the Duelist Grade X, so the overall damage is going to be lower. You pick up the inherent ability to apply Scarlet Rot, but on a really big, slow weapon, that's not really a huge benefit. Not to mention that also Scarlet Rot doesn't add that much overall DPS to a build. So when you take that into consideration, this is an A tier weapon. It's a very high A tier weapon, but with the damage drop off from the Duelist Grade X, I just can't justify putting it into the S tier. The Run Staff is another unique weapon. It cannot use Ashes of War. The scaling is not stellar on it. The damage on it is subpar. With all the loss of utility that comes with being a unique weapon, and not having great damage or any sort of factor to push it back up into consideration, this one stays at a C tier for me. The Staff of the Avatar, on the other hand, is also a unique weapon, so no Ash of War, but the strength scaling is actually insane. At plus 10, this weapon has an A strength scaling of 144, which is wild. It also tops out at 899 damage, and that's without putting anything into the Dex and Faith that this weapon also scales decently with. So you could actually push that much, much higher. The only reason that this is a really high A tier and not an S tier weapon for me is because part of that is holy damage. So without the ability to use Ashes of War, which means no Royal Knight's Resolve or anything like that to push the damage up higher, and the fact that it's holy damage partially, so we have to pass 2 damage resistance checks, I could not justify putting this into the S tier. But with the really high damage, I do have to note that this is an extremely high A tier weapon, especially considering it's a unique weapon. The Troll's Hammer is another pretty good unique weapon. It cannot use Ashes of War. This weapon does mostly physical, but then a little bit of fire damage. And this is another triple stat scaling unique weapon. So remember that this is based off of only 80 strength and just enough dex and faith to use the weapon. But being that it's a triple stat scaling weapon, you could put a lot more into dex and faith as well and push his damage up even much higher. And even 833 is a lot of damage. Even though it has to pass 2 damage resistance checks, because the damage is so high and can be pushed so much higher with a little bit more stat investment, I would put this as like a mid A. Not quite the damage potential of a high A like the Staff of Avatar, but pretty good overall damage. The Watchdog Staff is the last Colossal weapon. It's another unique weapon, so no Ashes of War. The scaling is really not that great on it. The damage is pretty poor on it. This would be a very low C for me. If I were pushing into the D tier, this would probably be in the D tier. Now let's look at all these weapons in the order that I personally would rank them on a tier list. Now I'm not going to waste your time by sitting here going over the same weapons I just went over with you. I'm just going to say the first 4 weapons are the best Colossal weapons in the game. You can feel comfortable using any of those weapons on a strength playthrough and know that you're maximizing your damage potential. All 4 of them can use any Ash of War, whether it's utility for clearing areas or Royal Knight's Resolve for trying to one-shot a boss. If you're on a strength playthrough and you're using Colossal Weapons and you want somewhere to dump your Somber Smithing Stones into, then I would go any of those in the A tier. You can't really go wrong. The damage is going to be really good. Just pick one that you like and go with it. Whether it's the Staff of the Avatar, the Troll's Hammer, the Falling Star Beast Jaw, whatever you want to use. I'd say those are good investments with your Somber Stones. Anything in the B tier, I would only use if you're specifically wanting to build something around like the Giza's Wheel or something for the bleed procs, or an Envoy's Greathorn build for the bubbles and the memes. And in the current state of the game, I personally feel like anything in the C category is not worth using your upgrade materials on right now. And that's it, guys. If you haven't checked out the new channel, I would definitely recommend you do so. That's where I'll be doing all the Comment of the Week awards, the live streams, and that's where I'll be giving away the Titus merch and stuff like that for those that won the Comment of the Week awards. So definitely subscribe and turn on your bell notifications on that channel so that you can find out if you won. With all the different weapon classes, I obviously have a lot more parts of this series coming up, so keep an eye out on this channel if you're looking for more weapon grades. So we'll catch you guys on the next one. Stay dangerous.